Are you stuck below 1200 ELO? Want to see how to easily crush 1200 rated players, or just want to see some interesting chess games? Well, I am the Chess Centurion. I'm a 2000 ELO player, and in today's video, we're going to be playing 3 games against 1200 rated players in rapid chess, and I'm going to talk you through my thought process while I play and show you guys how to beat players of this rating. Hopefully you find this educational and useful. Let's get into it. Alright, so jumping straight into the game with 1 e4, my opponent goes e5. GM Omar from Egypt. Egypt, yes, cool. I'm going to play there. We're going to play the Vienna. We'll see how our opponent responds to this. He goes knight to c6. Knight f6 would lead into the Vienna Gambit, but I have a playlist linked below, which this video will be a part of, with every single game on my channel where I have played the Vienna, whether it's the Vienna Game or the Vienna Gambit. And my opponent goes d6, which is good because bishop c5 leads to some insane lines after queen to g4, which are better for white, difficult, really difficult for black to navigate. But my opponent goes d6, which is a bit more of a solid approach. I'm going to go d3. This is kind of the setup that white adopts in the Vienna and basically controls the d5 square really, really well to try and prevent black from going d5, which is even more difficult with black's knight on c6, because if black does want to go d5, they kind of need the pawn on c6 to support a d5 push, which they don't get in this variation. I'm going to go f4, which you may think looks like a Vienna Gambit, but this is a little bit different because we've already set up our bishop, our knight, and our central pawns before playing the move f4, because f4 is now controlled by our bishop. My opponent takes, we're going to take back with the bishop. So we're not gambiting any pawns. We also don't have to worry about queen to h4 check, because the knight is blocking that. This bishop may move to the g5 square anyway to pin the knight to the queen. But typically, these positions tend to just have very easy development for white. You can see our development is already very good, and we have a good grip on the center. Probably moves like knight to f3. d4 may get played in the future as well, now that we've removed the e5 pawn from the board. And my opponent sacks his knight. Well, okay, I assume his idea is if knight takes e4, he's going to play d5, forking our bishop and knight and winning back the piece. But if we take back with the d-pawn, I don't see what our opponent does. Queen to h4 can just be met with bishop to g3 or g3, defending our bishop, blocking the check and attacking the queen. So this game might be really, really quick, and we might just have to play a second game here. Because I don't really want to make like a 5-minute video. If a game just ends really quickly, that would be a bit underwhelming. So we'll see what my opponent does. I'm really unsure about why he's gone ahead and done that. I will show you after the game the center fork trick, which is a trick that I used to use with the black pieces. Yeah, there is no plan here. I really don't know why my opponent's done what he's done, but okay. We're just going to go knight to f3, keep developing. I'd like to target the f7 square. I was considering moves like queen d5 or queen to h5, but they don't really work because the bishop can always come to e6 to block things, and I mean, moves like queen f6 also exist just to defend the pawn. So I think I'm just going to castle and get ready to set up ideas of attacking the f7 square. There's no need to think too hard about these moves because we're up a whole piece. I think my opponent realized that he did not have a way of winning the piece back. Yeah, okay, g5, I mean, doesn't really do anything. So, I suppose we can... I'm going to drop the bishop back to g3, just to monitor the e5 square, because we might try and play e5, and there could be some interesting lines with, like, e5 takes, and bishop takes f7 sort of ideas, trying to deflect the king away from the queen. There's those kinds of ideas, although I think we probably have even easier wins. Like bishop f7 here is quite tempting, and after king takes, maybe knight e5 double check. looks like it could be a decent move, although if the king goes back to e8, I don't see the follow-up. We could genuinely consider the move knight to e5. That wouldn't be stupid, because yeah, that actually wouldn't be stupid. Because okay, if knight takes, bishop takes, pawn takes, bishop f7 check, king e7, knight d5 check, the king has to step onto the d file, and then we have loads of discovered checks. And realistically, we're just giving the piece back. Even if we mess it up, we're already up a piece. So yeah, I mean, you can start with bishop to f7, but I think we need to keep the bishop on the board to control the e8 square when the bishop goes to f7, so we need to preserve that. So knight e5, if pawn takes, there, check, king has to step onto the d file, and if knight takes, pawn takes, bishop check, king moves up, and knight check, the king has to step onto the d file. And I am sure that there is some kind of checkmating pattern there. I am almost certain of it. So let's do it. Knight e5. I hope this sacrifice works. I think it does. I mean, at the end of the day, we have, what, 6 pieces participating in this attack? Black has 2 defenders. I don't know whether we can really call these bishops defenders. You know, if they were on squares like d7 or e6 or e7, then maybe, but on their home squares, they're not really participating too much. So I think knight e5 is the most clinical way to go about this. Give this check. The queen is defended, by the way, by the knight, so we're not necessarily trying to get the king to step away from the queen so we can take the queen. But this just looks crushing to me after this knight check, because the king has to step on to the d file, and then we're going to have unlimited discovered attacks. Like, at the very, very least, we can go knight to b6 check and pick up the rook in the corner. That's the absolute what's the word? The absolute minimum. The absolute minimum is we get a rook, and we sacrificed a knight for the attack and won a pawn, right? So we equalize the material. The material's equal now because my opponent sacked a knight for a pawn earlier. So at the very, very least, we go up a rook. I mean, that's pretty damn good. Also, I think I actually should have played this, because that's actually just checkmate. That's actually just mate. I just missed checkmate in one. Oh, yeah, this is just mate. I mean, the queen is skewered, obviously, but it is just checkmate. Okay, that was a little bit embarrassing. Little bit embarrassing. If we give this check and the king steps up, trying to get out of the mating net. Check here. I think the king escapes there. I can't believe I've just done that. That is really bad. Really bad. Oh, you know what? Let's just give the check on b6. Let's just give the check on b6. Keep things nice and easy. If the king steps back there, then we will deliver the checkmate in one. If the king steps forward, I mean, I don't see how you can defend yourself. Like, you're still probably going to get mated at some point. Probably bishop f2 ideas, but yeah, let's just give checkmate there. I don't know why I missed that in the first place. But let's do a brief analysis on this game, and then we will get into a second one. Okay, so we're just going to do a quick analysis of this game, and then we'll jump into a second one. But e4, e5, we have the Vienna. The Vienna Gambit occurs after knight to f6 and f4, but again, playlist below, loads of videos in that line. My opponent goes knight c6, we go bishop c4, like I said, bishop to c5 leads some wild positions after queen to g4. The most, I suppose, not popular, but famous one is this, where you give the pawn up on f2, and white is technically winning, but it's difficult. It's difficult for black, difficult for white. Black can get his queen trapped quite easily, and white can get mated quite easily. Queen f1 isn't mate because the bishop defends the f1 square, but my opponent goes for a bit of a passive approach, which isn't necessarily bad, it's just passive. We go d3, knight f6, and go f4. Taking is probably not the best idea from my opponent. It's not terrible, but there's no need for him to take. He can just develop, and I'm never ever going to take him, because after d takes, it opens up his bishop, solidifies his control over d4, and overall just helps the black position. More likely is a move like f5 at the right moment. Something like knight f3, applying more pressure, and let's say castles, then f5 is a better way for white to approach the position, trying to lock the bishop out. But my opponent takes, and we have knight takes e4, and it just doesn't work. Now, I think what my opponent got confused with is the 4 knights game with bishop to c4, where black can get a nice little advantage by going for this line. And after something like bishop d5, queen d5, black is better. The best line for white here is bishop to d3, taking like this. And material is equal. Black is slightly better, I think. But, you know, the game goes on. This is not the same thing. That's the kind of thing my opponent was trying to apply in this game, but it doesn't work. It's just a free piece. If I take with a knight, okay, yeah, then d5 kind of works, although it's not completely... It's not necessarily that simple, because I'm not just going to take. I might play a move like queen e2, trying to set up ideas like this, because you can blunder this game very quickly and get mated in one move if you take with the wrong piece, because this is double check, and the knight covers the d7 square. But we don't need to take with the knight, we can just take with the pawn. a6, we continue developing. h6, we castle. My opponent is really wasting time with these moves. He needs to be developing. g5, apparently knight g5 is the best move, and after takes, you have this. Discovered check and winning the queen. But, okay, we drop the bishop back. That's still perfectly fine. g4. And then we go knight to e5, which is not necessarily the best move, but it's given a brilliant move. It's only like 0.5 off of being the best move, and given white's advantage, like, who cares? If knight takes, which my opponent didn't do, then the plan was to do this, and then king e7, knight d5, let's say king d6. There's checks like rook f6, trying to force the king forward into a mating net, which would have been pretty interesting. But my opponent takes with the pawn, and after bishop f7, king e7, me, as a 2000 rated player, misses checkmate in one. I instead go knight d5. King d6, knight b6 check, and my opponent had to try and come forward here. You're still losing after a move like bishop f2, defending the knight through the king. And let's say the king keeps advancing, like, you are going to get mated at some point. There are ways to try and defend yourself with, like, knight d4, although you're obviously still losing. But fortunately for us, my opponent retreats, and I now spot the checkmate in one. So a very quick Vienna game, which I do think highlights the power of the Vienna. It is such a strong opening, even if your opponent like doesn't let you go into the gambit line, like the typical gambit line with f4 very early on. But obviously my opponent did just give me a free knight, but our position was still incredibly commanding because of the activity the opening provides. Anyway, let's jump into the second game. Okay, so game 2, and coincidentally, we have another Vienna. So this is going to make a very nicely themed video. My opponent is PVC Nambiar. I don't know if that's India or not. I think it's India. Yeah, okay. For some reason, like the thing in the middle just gets really difficult to see on the chess.com board. But here we do have a Vienna Gambit. So I suppose we get to see in the first game if your opponent plays knight c6 on the second move and you don't get a gambit. Whoa! What? Bishop d6. I've never seen that move ever. Now it makes no sense to take, right? Taking I don't. Well, actually no. Just takes d4. I was thinking takes and knight f3, then your opponent can take here and then take on e4. But can't I just go takes d4, bishop d6 and d5 and win a piece? Looks pretty good to me. That looks pretty damn good. d4, the bishop can't go to either of these squares. It has to go back to d6, and then we just trap. Well, sorry, not trap the bishop, but we just fork the bishop and the knight. I don't know what it is with people just trying to give me free pieces. Maybe like they see the fact that it's called a speed run, and they just, I don't know, try and do some really wild stuff. But a move like Queen E7 is not a concern. Yeah, my opponent does go for it, but it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change anything. Now, well, I mean, a move like Bishop to E2, my opponent can take, and get 2 pawns for the bishop, which isn't quite as bad. So I think Queen to E2 needs to be played, so that we add a defender while breaking the pin. So let's go Queen E2. I would like not to have to play Queen E2 because it does block the bishop's development, but in this case, it seems to be the best way to increase the advantage, right? In the short term, just with this tactical skirmish here. The bishop still only has 1 safe square, which is kind of hilarious. We are still stopping this knight from coming forward in any way at all. And I don't really know what my opponent can do here. Okay, he goes there, but this is actually really, well, it's obviously really bad, but it's really, really bad because the queen is also pinned, so my opponent has to trade queens with me as well. I didn't take with the knight there because I don't care if my pawns get doubled. It doesn't change anything. To be fair, it opens up this path for my bishop, and I also would prefer to get my knight to the f3 square, where I think it will be a lot more active. I'm tempted to start with bishop to f4 to target the c7 pawn, and then if d6 is played, that's just quite passive. So I'm going to do that. And again, just very, very easy opening here. My opponent just makes an early mistake. We capitalize. And it probably shouldn't be too difficult. Let's just keep playing normal moves. We may well get a third game in this video. We may well get one. Because I want to keep things interesting for you guys. But there's also very little I can do about my opponents just giving me free pieces, right? But okay. Let's make sure we convert this properly. Let's go bishop to d3. I think I want to bring my knight into the f5 square because the rest of its forward movement is currently stunted. Now, you could try something like knight d2, knight e4 to target f6, but I think it makes more sense to bring the knight to f5. Just to me, that looks nicer. We're going to play rook a to e1. I'm not concerned about bishop to h3 because I'm just going to go rook to f2 defending. And yes, I can't take because of the pin, but my opponent has no threat there. There is 0 threat in the position, and we can just continue playing chess. We are currently threatening to infiltrate the second rank with my rook. So knight c6 makes the most sense, developing the knight and also controlling the e7 square. Yeah, I mean, okay, knight c6, if that gets played, it isn't played, which is kind of interesting. We're just going to go rook to e7. Again, I'm really not concerned about this g2 pawn because it's defended, and my opponent is essentially tying up 2 of its pieces to my 1 piece, and I'm already up a piece. So, like, my 1 rook tying down a rook and a bishop, it's kind of like tying down 3 pieces because I'm already up a piece, if you get what I mean. So I have these 4 pieces that I can play with now, and my opponent only has 2. You see what I mean? Like, yeah, I was literally about to say you can't play a move like that because you hang the bishop. You know, I was tying this rook down by defending g2, rather than playing a move like g3 where the bishop would be safe, right? Again, I think my opponent may resign soon, or we may be able to weave some kind of mating net to end the game relatively quickly. I'm going to play rook g2 and just go for a trade. The knight is still hanging. It has no obvious movement apart from going to like b6, which, I mean, maybe you're going to try and come back into d5, but I could always play c4 to try and keep it locked out of the game. King f2. Keeps my king relatively active while also stopping this rook's infiltration to any of the g-file squares. Well, we actually control basically all of them with our various pieces. And the knight is still under attack, so I assume knight to b6 will be played. No, he defends the knight. Okay, let's just take on f7, not overcomplicate things. We have a threat of taking on h7. I think we probably just take, right? Not make things unnecessarily complicated. We have ideas of like knight h4, knight g6, and bishop to h6 to try and set up like rook to h8 things. Okay, let's take on c7. This is kind of mopping up a bit here. I feel a bit bad, but like, oh, okay, that's on me. That's on me. I just completely forgot about that. We can play bishop c4 to pin the knight, but then d5. Okay, I should have probably seen that. That's not great. Bishop c4 d5. Yeah, I think we're just making our life worse by doing that. We could actually consider the move bishop to f5, inviting my opponent to take and then trying to trade rooks, but he would just take on c7 instead, so that doesn't work. This check doesn't seem to do anything useful because the king just moves. Now, if the king goes here, we can give this check and save the bishop and then move the rook. But if check and king to h8, then we don't have anything. So it might make the most sense to take on d6 actually, because then if takes, we have 3 minor pieces versus a rook and a bunch of pawns. And if here and rook takes, then we take on b7 and we basically get 2 pawns for the piece. So I think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to do that. I don't even know what the best way for black to go about this is. Probably taking like this and allowing me to take on b7. But I mean, even still, it is horrific. Okay, he goes for that. We're going to take the knight, attack the rook. And how do we continue? I mean, probably just pushing the h-pawn. I think that's all we really need to be concerned about here. All we really need to focus on, I think. Let's go bishop to b8, just attacking the a7 pawn. And then, well, there's loads of different things we can do. But I think we keep it simple and just start pushing the h-pawn. Let's get Harry rolling. This f6 pawn is doing a good job of keeping my knight out of the game. So it is quite an annoying pawn. I'm not concerned about a move like rook to b7 attacking my bishop and keeping an eye on a7. That doesn't really do anything because I just move my bishop and the rook kind of sucks on the b7 square. Let's keep pushing. I'm also stopping rook c7 going after my weak pawn because we control that square. Although even if the rook could go to c7, we just push. That's not a problem. What do we want to do here? I'm thinking of this to control the h6 square to stop the king from coming in, and then we can start pushing again. But I think bishop to f4 makes a bit more sense, just controlling the square with the bishop, because the knight doing it is a little bit flimsy, and it also takes 2 moves. So after knight to h4, my opponent could start with king to h6, and then I don't really want to put my bishop on the g6 square. I just don't want to put it there. Okay, my opponent attacks. Let's give the check. We control the h7 square as well, so king h8 is the move I expect. And then knight h4 looks nice. Okay, that is interesting. That is interesting. Do we push or no? Do we push or no? Not sure. I'm gonna go knight h4. Okay, I think that's probably the best move, but we're fine because both our pawns are protected. Let's give this check. See what my opponent does. Okay, I was not expecting that move at all. Now we could play the funny move h4, and everything kind of defends each other. Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. And then I think the next plan of action would probably be to bring my king up. Maybe. Okay, f5. That's not a problem. Obviously, it's blocking my bishop's control of the knight, so let's give this check. And then probably followed by bishop to g5, locking this rook behind both pawns and the bishop, which would mean that the f5 pawn will be hanging, but also the rook is completely trapped. I half expect my opponent to take here, because the rook is going to die. He doesn't, okay. So I think just bishop to e2 picks up the rook. So that's completely game over. My opponent played on maybe a bit longer than necessary here, but made it interesting. I did miss a knight fork, which was a little bit silly. I probably should have seen this knight to e6 move. So it would have been better not to put my rook on c7, but my opponent resigns. Pretty solid game. We'll do a brief analysis of it, and then we'll jump into a third game, because I don't want to leave you guys on two games that were kind of won early on, you know? So let's get into it. Okay, so e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6. Like I say, this leads to the Vienna Gambit with f4. Bishop d6 is a horrific move, though. I've never seen it with good reason. I did say this in a previous video, like a few videos ago, where my opponent played a strange opening, and I managed to find a way to punish it, because it was an opening I'd never seen before. But a lot of the time, when you see these moves, that you're just like, what on earth is that? How have I never seen that before? A lot of the time, it's because it's bad. So you should figure out why it's bad. And f takes e5, bishop takes e5, d4. My opponent has one option, e5. Queen e7 obviously pins the pawn to the king. And I did say, you know, bishop e2 can be played, but my opponent can win 2 pawns for the bishop. And yes, we go knight f3 with an attack on the queen, and we get very nice development with like castles, maybe bishop g5 ideas. But why overcomplicate it? Queen e2 is better. Bishop b4. My opponent saves the bishop but loses the knight. And it's particularly bad because my opponent can't take on f6 with the queen, and they are forced to trade queens with me, which is really nice for me because I'm up a piece. Takes, gf6, and then we just develop. We attack c7, forcing d6. Obviously, that does open up the bishop, which my opponent wants to do anyway, but I didn't want my opponent to go d5 because it's just a bit more active. So forcing d6 rather than d5 just makes my opponent's position even more passive, and also gives me access to the c4 square in the future potentially. Knight f3, castles, king h8, clearly going for this idea which he did implement. Bishop d3, I'm eyeing up the f5 square. My bishop's also just better on d3, can see more squares, and also we open up the e-file for ourselves. Rook g8, rook a to e1, bishop h3, not a concern whatsoever. Bishop g3 also existed to just break the pin completely and force the bishop back. But I thought it'd be interesting to defend with the rook, because we also, like I say, tie down 2 of my opponent's pieces by doing that. Knight d7 was very surprising. Knight c6 is by far the best move. But knight d7, rook e7. And if my opponent was going to defend the knight, he needed to do it like this. And we win the f7 pawn and threaten mate. So probably knight to f8 defending is one of the only moves. But my opponent chooses to defend with the other rook. So we take the bishop, free bishop, gives a check. We offer a rook trade, and then rook g8 check, king f2. My opponent has to go back to defend. We take on f7. And I mean, the game kind of plays itself. Here my opponent did have a nice idea with knight back to f8, attacking the rook. And here I needed to play rook to e7 to keep the biggest advantage possible, because my bishop stops the knight from coming this way, and my rook kind of stops the knight from coming this way. Then I can go back to d7, but that doesn't accomplish anything. I can probably just start throwing the pawn down the board. But we accidentally give up the fork, and yeah, the computer agrees bishop d6 is the best move here for white. Takes. It was better for my opponent to do this, which I think I said during the game was probably his best option to try and keep more pieces on the board. But we go into a 3 minor pieces versus rook endgame, but I'm also up several pawns, so it's even worse. We attack the pawn, start throwing our h-pawn down the board, bishop f4, stopping the king from getting in. Rook d5, give the check, king back to f8. I was expecting king to h8, but apparently not. I guess it doesn't make much of a difference. Computer thinks that's the better move anyway. Knight h4, rook h5, knight g6 check. The king comes to f7. I was expecting king to g8. The computer thinks that that's worse for black, but it's all bad. It's all bad. King f7 is played, best move. h4, trying to lock the rook away. And then f5. Now, my opponent didn't have to do that, but there was very little he could do. If he tries to get the rook out of there, we just push. And our knight controls the h8 promotion square, so it's really, really bad news for my opponent. He kind of has to keep the rook to monitor the h7 square. But f5, knight e5 check, the king moves up, and we just trap the rook. So after king to e6, bishop to e2, the rook has nowhere to go. Even if you do sack the rook for the bishop, after h takes g5, these pawns are going to march through very, very easily. So my opponent resigns. Another nice Vienna game, relatively simple, but the Vienna is just great. It's great stuff. I hope it's still educational in the sense that you can see how to convert these winning positions. I guarantee at least 30% of you would find a way to have lost the game from this, let's say even this position. I think 30% of you would have found a way to lose the game. Anyway, let's get into the third game and hopefully we get a slightly longer one. Okay, so we have e4 c6, the beginning of the Caro Kann. We're against El Padrino del Tocal from Spain. And he goes for the hillbilly attack, which is a really, really strange line of the Caro Kann. I think the proper way to do it is actually to drop the bishop back to b3 and invite me to take on e4, but my opponent takes, so we're obviously going to take, attack the bishop. I'm expecting bishop to b3. Yep, there we go. And let's go knight to f6, just reinforcing our center. I'm hoping for knight to f3, so I can pin the knight to the queen, but my opponent doesn't go for that. He goes queen to f3. You have pressure on d5, but this is very well defended. So I'm going to go knight c6, trying to eye up the d4 square, which would fork the queen and the bishop, and also put pressure on c2. A move like knight to e2 is playable, but bishop g4 could cause some issues for white with skewering the queen and the knight, and let's say something like knight e2, bishop g4, queen e3, takes, and knight d5 could be kind of uncomfortable. He does go for it. Well, let's deliver this skewer. I don't have to commit to taking the knight. I can ponder a little bit. Because to be fair, if we go for that line at the end with knight to d4, my opponent can play bishop to a4 check and get his bishop out of the line of fire. So that might not actually be the best way to go about it. But the g4 square is a good developing square for our bishop regardless. And after something like queen to e3, I think I'm just going to play e6, secure the d5 pawn to lock this bishop out of the game. My opponent may have to go for c4 at some point to try and break the bishop back into the game, which would make a lot of sense. Yeah, he goes for queen to e3. We could consider the move d5 here. Sorry, d4, attacking the queen with the support of our knight and our queen. It's not obvious where my opponent puts the queen, actually, because if you go to d3 to maintain an eye on the knight, I mean, you can do that, but after the move e5, maybe there's threats of pawn to e4. Maybe. I don't know. I do like the idea of d5, but I also don't like the idea of opening up the bishop. So maybe just the move e5, preparing this idea followed by this, and not committing too early. E6 is definitely a good move, but it seems a little bit passive. It feels like I should be really taking control of the game here. And also e5, if c4 ever comes in the future, then d4 is more playable because it's supported by a pawn. So let's do it. Let's go e5. I'm pretty sure that works. Yeah, that should be fine. I don't really want to take this knight. It's not a great piece. And if my opponent castles, then the queen will be tied down to the defense of the knight anyway, which will be a bit inconvenient for him. And even if the queen moves now, like if I take the knight, then the king will have to take, and that is going to be very awkward because you won't be able to castle. But my opponent goes g4, sorry, not g4, f3, attacking my bishop and cutting the connection to the knight, which makes a lot of sense. I think bishop to f5 is very reasonable. I could consider bishop to e6 though, defending the d5 square again. It is well defended, to be fair though. It is well defended. Let me think. If I go to f5, I'm expecting knight g3, bishop to g6, and I monitor the c2 square, but also this pawn is probably going to move to c4 or c3 anyway. So let's drop the bishop back to e6. It probably participates a bit more in the game if it's on the e6 square, I think. Okay, that's just a one-move threat. We don't have to be concerned about that at all. My opponent's trying to pin the knight so that the queen can take on e5, so I think just bishop to d6. I don't care. If my opponent takes here and I take back with the b-pawn, fantastic. The b file will be very useful for my rook, and I also get really, really nice defense on the d5 square. My opponent's also made 3 moves with his bishop in 9 in the 9 moves that have been played, 3 of them are with his bishop, and that's a lot of moves to invest into a piece that isn't that like great. I'm trying to think of a more eloquent word, but great is also a fine word to use. It's not that impressive, not that impressive. That's what I'm trying to say. I like the move e4 here, because if takes, I can take with the knight, and we have some nice attacking ideas in the future. Taking makes no sense because knight takes, and we're under a lot of threat, and I also don't really want to allow my opponent to take. So let's go e4. If my opponent plays f4, we could consider knight to g4, but I don't think that does anything. I think we probably just ignore my opponent. We could always put the bishop back on g4 if we want to be annoying. But I think with a protected passed pawn on e4, that's definitely just good for us. Definitely good for us. And we can probably just castle and be quite happy. The only thing we ought to be concerned about is maybe f5 could be an issue in the future, or my opponent could throw more pawns at me on the king side. But I'm not that scared, especially because his development isn't all that impressive, you know? He's only got 3 pieces out, and they're not amazing pieces. They're really not. So it's not very concerning at all. Also, as I'm recording this video, I've hit 3,000 subscribers, so thank you very, very much. The recent support has been absolutely fantastic and really motivating, so I do really appreciate it. And if you're currently watching the video and enjoying it up to this point, then please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Back to the game, back to the game. My opponent puts more pressure on the center, which makes a lot of sense. Let me think. Let me think. We could castle. And if takes, takes, I don't think we have good enough compensation to warrant giving up a pawn. The move bishop f5 is playable, but I don't like knight to g3, attacking my bishop and my pawn. I don't really want to take like this and open up my opponent's rook. So I think taking probably makes the most sense. Yeah, let's just take. Let's just take. If my opponent takes with the g-pawn, then he's going to have some very big weaknesses on this diagonal, and it's going to become impossible for him to castle kingside. And if he takes with the queen, then I think we just castle. Although bishop g5 ideas are annoying there, because he's going to have a lot of pressure on this knight. So maybe... I don't know, actually. That is kind of annoying. We could go back to g4, but my opponent could just deliver a check on the e-file, which is kind of annoying. The d5 square is well defended, so that's not really a concern, and we always have like bishop to g3 check ideas if the queen ends up on d5 with a discovered attack on my opponent's queen. That's a very common tactical idea to keep in mind. Do we have any? I'm trying to think of like, I don't know, knight g4 and queen h4 ideas, but I think after g3 the attack fizzles out. h6 is worth considering, just stopping this bishop from coming to the g5 square. I think my opponent's done quite well with his position, actually. He's broken out with the move f3 quite effectively. We could consider castling queenside, but I don't think it makes enough sense, to be honest. I think h6 is the move I'm going to go for, just because this bishop g5 idea is so annoying. Bloody hell. I'm expecting one of these pieces to end up on f4 pretty soon. Maybe not immediately, but pretty soon. Okay, that move makes no sense. No sense at all. Let's just castle, unpin this knight. If my opponent wants to take, go for it. I will happily get really nice defense of the d5 pawn, and then my knight and my bishop no longer have to sit here defending it. This just weakens the dart squares around the king, which is not a good idea. If my opponent plays something like, yeah, this just doesn't help. I was going to say, if my opponent tries to develop this bishop, I've got ideas of queen to b6, trying to eye up some of the weaknesses in the white position. But as I mentioned all the way back in this position, if my opponent ever takes, please open up the b file for me. I'll be more than happy. More than happy. This means that my knight and my bishop now don't have to care about defending the d5 pawn. They can go off and do something else. To be fair, this bishop has limited mobility, and h3 might have been played to stop bishop g4 ideas. My bishop can't come to f5 because the queen controls that square. So it's not obvious what I'm going to do with the bishop. Also not obvious what I'm going to do with the knight. e4 is the most natural square, but currently that doesn't really help. I could follow it up with bishop d5 ideas, trying to point my bishops towards my opponent's weak king side, which is definitely viable. Definitely viable. I think rook to e8 makes the most sense here, because I'm threatening bishop to g4 discovered check. And if my opponent takes, then I'll just take with the rook, give my opponent a check, maybe double up my rooks on the e-file. It doesn't make any sense to me to take like this, because then my opponent's bishop will become very active and probably plant itself on the e5 square. Castling for my opponent is definitely a good move. Again, I don't think this does anything that useful. Queen b6 again is very tempting. I don't like this activity down the f-file, but I think we're okay. Queen b6 just applies some nice pressure. A move like bishop to e3 hangs the b-pawn, which I think we can get away with because of the weakness of this knight. So let's go queen to b6. I think I like this idea. And we're just going to ask some questions. My bishop's currently doing a good job of keeping everything together and making sure f7 isn't vulnerable. Again, my opponent can take the bishop, absolutely. But then I'm going to take with the rook, and you can't attack the rook very easily unless you rotate this knight around to f4 to apply pressure to the rook. And if my rook is on e6, then my knight is very well defended on f6, and it's going to become basically impossible for my opponent to break through the f-file because I'll have such a tight grip of the f6 square. And he does play knight to e2, which has the dual purpose of defending the d4 pawn and also potentially replacing the knight on f4. It does, however, allow me to play the move knight to e4, but after takes ideas, then f7 will be undefended because my knight will no longer be blocking the queen. So that wouldn't be brilliant. My opponent's also probably preparing the move c3 to shore up his center. So part of me wants to go c5 to try and break it apart as soon as possible. Although then bishop to e3 taking doesn't make as much sense because there's no knight here that is hanging. I also just realized the queen was defending the knight in those variations, so that is a bit of an oversight, but it is what it is. My opponent's defending, well, not defending, sorry, but playing this position pretty well. I would love to play moves like bishop to f5 and bishop to e4, but it doesn't really work because I think my opponent has discoveries against my bishop, which I don't love. Although, do they actually work? No, they don't work, because after bishop to f5, let's say knight to d5, pawn d5, queen f5, then the knight will hang. So yeah, let's do bishop to f5. We might be able to bait my opponent into trying tactics here and just forget about his knight on the e2 square. That could be very fruitful. So let's see if my opponent does fall for it. And if he doesn't, I mean, c2's under attack, so maybe he just goes c3. Called it. And yeah, bishop to e4 looks decent. Maybe queen g3, trying to set up attacking ideas on the g file. Could be annoying. I'd love to go bishop to g6 to shore up my defense, but the knight is doing a very good job at stopping me. Well, I don't actually have to move my bishop just yet, because again, these ideas still don't work, because the knight still hangs. So maybe I just try and double my rooks, play something like rook e7 to try and play rook a to e8. Put pressure on the knight, just put pressure on the c file, sorry, the e file in general. Stop moves like bishop to e3 in the future. Very, very viable. I think I like that. Let's go. We can always go bishop to e4 at any point, which will obviously come with an attack on the queen. Ah, interesting. So I have to take this knight, right? I've got to take it. Let's take. If queen f5, I can't take here because of this. Also bear in mind there are back rank ideas potentially because my bishop covers the h2 square. My queen is caught a bit offside on b6 to be fair. It's not best placed. And I think just bishop to g6 looks comfortable. Let's play it. We attack the queen. We obviously cover f7 again, which means this rook can do whatever it wants. And after something like bishop g4, there's no... Sorry, we're blocking the g file, so there's no pin on the g7 pawn. And like, you know, say queen to g4, we could consider the move h5 actually, stopping any h-pawn advances, but we don't have to yet. If my opponent goes h4, then we can probably respond with the move h5. There's no need to preempt that. There is a case to be made after like queen to g4 to go bishop to d3, but this looks way too scary. I don't want to do that. Even if you can maybe get away with it with like f5, attacking and defending, I don't want to do that. After something like queen to g4, I think just rook a to e8, targeting the knight is a fine move. And let's say here, and the knight comes to f4, then I will take. And after bishop takes, I will take on b2. And we have a lot of pressure over here. My opponent doesn't really have too many attacking ideas either. So let's double up. I'm expecting this. And I will take. Because there is no second knight to replace it. And this bishop isn't quite as effective, not only because it's guarding b2, but also because my bishop is defending the king's side so nicely. There's not really ideas of sacking on h6 right now. So I like this position. I like this. A move like rook to e1 doesn't really make sense because you're just pinning yourself. You're just making your own life harder. And I mean, technically there's ideas of like rook e1, bishop to g3, because if knight takes, then you take the rook, and if this, then you take the knight. You don't win any material, but you could argue you get a bit of activity. Um, Debatable. But I think actually if rook to e1, the best move might be queen to b8. Still keeping an eye on this, but supporting a bishop to g3 move, which would have been interesting, but my opponent doesn't go for it. I still like this idea though. Oh, but okay, so if the knight moves up now and we trade, then the rook defends the b2 square. That's quite nice. Nice find from my opponent. So how do we do this? How do we do this? Well, we could attack the queen. I don't know if that does anything that useful though. Queen h5. Well, then we can play bishop to d3. And my opponent has issues with the back rank. Because we're not only controlling f1, so rook f1 would lose a rook if my rook makes it to e1, but this is also covered. So maybe bishop to e4 isn't a silly idea. We do have to keep an eye on f7, which is true. It is currently defended by the rook, though. Let's say here, queen g4 setting up bishop to h6 ideas. We could play the move f5, attacking the queen and blocking the f-file up. Queen h5, bishop c3, sorry, bishop d3, attacking the knight. If knight g3, oh, you could rotate the knight back around to f1. Okay, so maybe it makes more sense to go queen to b8 first to stop knight g3 ideas. But if queen b8, knight f4, queen b8, knight f4, we can give a check. Rook blocks. Take, take. I don't think we have a good follow-up. I mean, we could go takes, and if bishop takes, then we can take on b2. But if takes and queen takes... Oh no, then we can give another check on e1, and after the king moves, then we take the queen, and bishop can't take because the rook hangs. Let's do it. Let's do it. Queen b8. Queen b8. I think this is a good move. We are reinforcing our control over this very important diagonal, and we are also keeping an eye on the b2 square. And like I say, my opponent has back rank issues if we get our rook to e1. Because we are also, I think we're toying with, what is it? We're toying with like bishop g3 ideas, potentially. My opponent goes b4, which makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Just getting the b2 weakness forward so that it's defended by this pawn. And now let's think. Now let's think. What's our idea here? What are we doing? Again, we have this bishop to e4 move, which we can consider. Because b4 doesn't do anything to help with the back rank issues. If queen g4, again, we have this f5 move, which I think is powerful. Although queen g6 could be played. But then maybe f4, opening up the bishop's attack on the queen. And if the queen comes back to g4, the queen goes back to g4, bishop h6 is a threat. Maybe f3, although bishop h6 can be played. But our rook defends g7 though, so then we just take the knight. I kind of like this idea. I think just the way that our pieces are coordinated here should mean that tactics work in our favor. Because our pieces are so active and doing so many important jobs, compared to my opponent's pieces, This bishop is technically participating in the attack, but this knight isn't great. The rook is just doing nothing. And this rook is okay. It is doing a lot of defensive jobs, to be fair, but it's nothing special. It's definitely nothing special. I think f5 makes a lot of sense. Let's play it. Let's play it. Now, queen g6 can also be met with rook to e6, which I hadn't initially considered, and a move like queen to h5. I don't know what our follow-up is there. So queen h5 immediately might be good for white, because we have no obvious way of attacking the queen. And then what do we do? Then what do we do? Well, of course, bishop to d3 is still the move that should come into your mind first, which I think is actually very hard to meet. I think it's very hard to meet. Now, the reason we have to throw f5 in is so that the rook controls g7, and f5 obviously comes with a threat, so my opponent has to respond to it. But with f5 being played, it means our rook defends g7, so bishop h6 ideas don't really come with too much of a threat if it does get played. Even if we do lose the h6 pawn, potentially, we may just win this knight in return. So like bishop to d3 here looks very, very tempting. And if we move like bishop to h6, we can probably just ignore my opponent and take. And if like rook takes, there's actually no threat. My opponent has no threat because we forced the queen away from attacking g7. So I like this idea of bishop to d3. Now the knight can't go to g3, of course. So the knight probably has to come to f4. But then we give this check. And if something like king to h2, then we take the bishop. And if rook takes, then bishop takes f4 with a check and an attack on the rook, which should be winning. Should be winning. I don't know what else white does. If like, I don't know, king f1 defending the knight, there's no way you can play that. I think probably bishop to g3 just wins the game for black because the knight is pinned and can't take the bishop. So, yeah, I think we should do it. I think we should do it. Bishop d3. Now, this has been a very, very interesting game, so I'm very glad that we did play a third game because the first two, they make sense, right? Like, we played a decent opening, my opponent blundered, then we capitalized on the blunder and had a pretty swift victory. But this is a bit more interesting because we're really having to formulate difficult attacking ideas and try and maximize our pieces to their utmost potential. The only piece that I could say isn't being maximized is my queen. I would love to be able to swap my bishop and my queen around and go something like queen to h2. But obviously, that's not how chess works. But my queen's still performing the important role of just supporting this bishop in any attack. And it did also not force, but encourage my opponent to play the move b4, which did kind of waste a tempo and allow our attack to build up more venom, because it gave us time to play the preparatory move of bishop to e4. So, okay, let's see what my opponent finds, because bishop d3 looks crushing. It looks crushing. I really don't know what he can do. Bishop to f4 does nothing, because I just take, or probably take with the bishop, actually, to attack the queen. So that doesn't help, because my bishop is well defended. And also, by taking, I'm attacking the queen and removing the defender of the bishop, so it will be hanging. I don't know what else he does, because these pieces are just so out of the game. Like a move like bishop to h6 makes sense if we have like takes and takes, and my opponent, I mean, that there are no perpetuals because queen g6 can be met with rook to g7, and you can't deliver this check. My opponent does go for it, and it makes sense because if I take on f4, then you take with the knight, and white is probably maybe not winning, but probably better in that position. But no, of course, we take on e2, remove the defender, attack the queen. You can probably take with the rook, but I feel like it's easier to take with the bishop because we keep our very nice defense of our king, and we also just attack the queen. So we're encouraging the move queen to h4. And if takes and like rook takes, then we can play rook to e4, trying to encourage further trades because, of course, we're up a whole bishop in that line. And if queen h4 takes and queen takes, of course, we will very happily trade the queens off the board because that makes the endgame conversion far, far simpler without the queen. So yeah, very happy with that game. It's not quite over yet, of course. We still need to try and convert it as accurately as we possibly can. But my opponent plays a very strange opening gambit, which, like I say, I have seen before, but this queen f3, I'm not sure I have seen. What do most people play in this position? I think c4 is a normal idea, or maybe d4 followed by c4. But we'll see after the game what the computer has to say. My opponent's still thinking on this move. He may resign once he's realized he's losing a piece, or he might play out losing a piece and then resign. We'll see. We'll see what he does. But yeah, okay. Very solid game, really. And like I say, very interesting attacking ideas. Still thinking. I mean, your queen can't really do a whole lot of things. Of course, taking makes no sense because I will just take. Maybe he wants to do rook takes bishop, rook takes rook, and bishop to h6. Maybe that's his plan. But I don't think that really helps him. I don't think that really helps him because if he does this, okay, no, he doesn't go for it. So irrelevant. I didn't actually consider this move, to be fair. I didn't actually consider it. We could take and go rook f8 to try and force some trades because this rook will keep defending the bishop, so that's not a problem. I did consider the move rook to f8 or rook to f7 immediately, but this feels like it's easier to force trades with. Yeah, let's just do this. And at the very least, we'll get another... Oh wait, no, because the queen also attacks the rook, so my opponent has to take in order to avoid losing more material. And then we are just up a bishop for a pawn, which is great. It's great. Very, very nice. Happy with that. I think we've converted this very cleanly in a way that allows my opponent as few chances as humanly possible, which is of course what we want to do. We also control the f1 square, which is useful because there's only 2 open files on the board. So if something like rook to e1, I think bishop c4, attacking a2 and maintaining control of the f1 square really encourages white to trade the rooks, which of course benefits us. Because if something like takes, let's say a4, then, I mean, we just get our king involved as actively as possible, and we will shoulder this king further back because we have a bishop, and he gives me the rook, so that's very nice. And then, I mean, up a whole rook. That's not even a question. Not even a question of whether we're going to convert it. Let's get into the analysis. I hope you guys enjoyed this game. This game has been very, very interesting. Let's see what the computer has to say about it. So, very nice game. We played at 89.5% accuracy, which is pretty good. And I think we maintained our advantage pretty much the whole game. So, let's go through it. My opponent goes e4, c6, bishop c4, which is just a very interesting line. Of course, d5 is the move. And like I say, there are a lot of ideas of like bishop b3, de4, and playing it gambit style like this. But my opponent decides to take, which is the best move. And after takes bishop b3, we go knight f6, just developing. Bishop f5 is apparently the best move. But like I said, I was hoping my opponent would go knight to f3 so I could pin the knight. Just personal preference. I don't really like the bishop on f5. Just personally, I don't like it that much. But queen to f3 is not the best move. We go knight c6, knight e2, and play bishop g4, which is the best way to go about the position. And after knight to e3, queen to e3, I did consider taking, and after queen e2, knight to d4 ideas, but bishop a4 exists, like I said, and I would just be forced to retreat one of my knights, which defeats the whole purpose of what I was doing. So we go e5, which is the best move. My opponent goes f3. We drop the bishop back to e6, where it is probably more useful than h5. Bishop a4, inaccuracy, doesn't really do anything. Bishop d6 is the best move. I'm very happy I was finding a lot of these moves. And then d4, which was a very nice move from my opponent, because I made a mistake by playing the move e4. Castling was apparently the best, but I was concerned about bishop c6, because if I take, then take, and I lose a piece. But I did miss that I can take on d4 first. And after, say, knight d4, bc6, if we have a trade here, my opponent can't take. Oh no, he can take. Sorry, it comes with check. And then if, like, castles, the computer thinks I'm winning, but... Oh, knight e4 moves. Wow, you can't take because I'll mate you. Very, very interesting stuff. But we go e4 because I didn't want to allow the knight in. Knight bc3 is a good move. I take on f3. Again, not the best move. Castling was better, but I wasn't sure what I'd do after this. de4. If knight e4, then knight e4, queen e4, rook e8. And the computer just thinks that I have massive compensation in terms of pressure. Oh, and I'm just kind of winning this knight. So, yeah, interesting. That's a lot to calculate, though. And I take on f3, queen f3, and we go h6. Not the best move, but it's basically an equal position here. But bishop takes c6 is just not the way to go. It doesn't accomplish anything. It just helps me. And then knight to f4. Rook e8 is a miss. Bishop f5 immediately is the best move. And if this, here, and here, then I have, I assume, bishop g3 and queen h4 moves. So I did miss that. But rook e8 is okay. My opponent castles. We go queen b6, putting pressure. Knight c to e2. And bishop f5 is the best move, which we do find. So I was very happy about that. And c3 was actually the best defense. Rook e7. Bishop e4 was preferred by the computer. But I was a little bit concerned about queen g3. I know the knight is pinned, but the computer wants to rile up the pressure with queen c7. After b3, king h7. Maybe the plan is to go knight to h5 at the ideal moment. And really put some pressure on this position. But rook e7 is fine. Knight h5, we take on h5, which is the only move, really. If you take on f5, which is the best move, and that's what I was expecting more so, knight back to f6 is fine. Probably what I was going to play. And black has a slight advantage. If something like knight to f4 here, rook e5 exists, you can maybe double up and just play the position as it is. Black is probably more active than white, but my opponent takes on h5, which was strange. Bishop g6 is an inaccuracy. We should have gone for bishop d3 immediately. Why didn't I do that? Why didn't I do that? I don't know. Maybe I was concerned about this. I didn't need to be, though, because this is just bad. And if, like, rook e1... Again, these bishop g3 ideas exist at the very, very least. The very least, I can just double up as well. And white is losing. But, okay, I make a mistake with bishop g6. It's still good, though. We double up. Rook f2. Queen b8, best move. Very happy about finding that. And then b4, bishop e4, again the best move. Queen g4, and we find f5. Very happy with this sequence of moves. Queen h5, and we go bishop to d3, which is the only move that keeps a significant advantage. And this is impossible for white. If something like knight to f4, we give a check. If the king goes to h2, then, like I say, we take, and take here with check. And we're up, what, probably 2 bishops for a rook. Like, let's say here we take 2 bishops for a rook. And if my opponent takes, we're going to take this rook and mate my opponent eventually. But bishop to f4, we take on e2, removing the defender. Queen f5, takes, and keep it very, very simple with rook f8. The computer prefers to move bishop to d3, trying to dislocate, that's not the move, deflect the queen away from defending the rook. But from a human perspective, I think rook f8 is the best move because we force this. We just force it. There's nothing else white can do. He has to trade everything, and white has nothing in this endgame. He can't do anything. If he trades rooks, we win. If he gives us a rook like he did in the game, we win. And if he moves his rook away to avoid a trade, I mean, look at this kind of activity. Although that actually does allow rook f1 check, so maybe rook e3 is a bit better. And then if king f2, then give this check and pick up the a2 pawn. I would be careful not to play a move like bishop a2, which is playable, but it does, one, allow rook to f1 check, or gives white an open file. And a7 is defended, luckily, so that's not really a concern, but it's unnecessary. Just infiltrate with the rook, and it's a lot easier. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it since you made it all the way to the end. If you want to see how to beat higher rated players rather than lower rated players, then click the video that is going to show up somewhere on the screen here. It is a really interesting one, and I know you're going to enjoy it.